Thanks to everyone that is joining us. Welcome to our virtual student chapter webinar, Mentoring for Emerging Professionals, Finding Your Path. This is part of a series of webinars provided by our virtual student chapter, specifically targeting our student members' professional development. Before we jump in, I do want to remind our student members that registration is free for students at our national events. I sent a note out to all our student members highlighting our upcoming national event calendar. I particularly wanted to highlight our annual meeting, which will be held here in Washington, D.C., May 27th to 29. Please consider attending if you're in the D.C. area, since it's a local meeting. Unfortunately, we don't have budget to sponsor travel for our students, but any student member interested in attending can contact your post to see if they have sponsorship funds available to send. It's a great opportunity to do professional networking, find out what's going on with the industry, and also connect with other student members. Over the course of this year, we really want to emphasize the member part of your student membership, not just the student part. Also, before we begin with the webinar, I have a couple of housekeeping announcements. Please hold your questions to the end of the presentation, or you can submit them through the chat box on the GoToMeeting platform. I'll be monitoring that and can chime in to Colonel Kimball if we need. Also, please mute your phones when not speaking so that we don't get any background noise. And we'll be making a recording of the presentation and a PDF of the slides available after the webinar, if you want to recapture some of the content. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Colonel Ray Kimball, who will be giving us his perspectives on the role of or responsibilities of emerging professionals. Excuse me. Colonel Kimball is the Chief of Faculty Learning, Innovation, Collaboration, and Research at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, where he also serves as Director of the Center for Junior Officers. He graduated from West Point in 1995 and went on to earn a master's degree in history from Stanford University. He served in the Obama administration in 2009 as the Executive Assistant and Chief of Staff for the European Affairs Directorate of the National Security Office. And in 2015, he completed a PhD in learning technologies through Pepperdine University, where he wrote a dissertation on the Army Officer's Guide to Mentoring. And it's that resource that brought him to us. We're very happy to have him participating with us. And with that, I'll welcome Colonel Kimball.
Fantastic. Eddie, thank you so much for this opportunity to speak, and certainly thanks to everybody on the webinar for joining in. As Eddie mentioned, I'm going to ask you to hold your questions to the end, just because it always is a little bit challenging with webinars without kind of visual cues. But rest assured, I will definitely leave plenty of time for your questions at the end, because I find that in sessions like this, I honestly learn as much as I give just by virtue of hearing what kinds of questions people are asking and what really what they're interested in. And as Eddie mentioned, you're also welcome to throw your questions up in the chat box, and I can either answer them kind of in stride, or if it's something that I want to save until the end, then I'll do so. Because this is a student chapter, I decided that I really wanted to focus today's talk in talking about the transition from student mentoring to workplace mentoring, and what you should expect as you move into the workplace in terms of mentoring, what mentoring relationships are like, what they can do for you, and also some warning signs to look out for. And then I'll conclude with just some practical suggestions for getting started on workplace mentoring, because I know that can feel very daunting, especially as you come into a profession for the first time. So let me just start by talking about student mentoring versus workplace mentoring and the differences between them. And this is important because the term mentoring means really different things in those two contexts, so much so that they are actually entirely separate areas of study for folks who study mentoring for a living, student mentoring versus workplace mentoring. So student mentoring is really centered around a master-apprentice model. And what I mean by that is that the roles in student mentoring are pretty fixed. So an individual is always the student, and somebody else is always the instructor or the teacher or the master, depending on kind of the specific context. And so because of that student mentoring is always grounded in a specific educational context. Maybe it's secondary school, maybe it's higher education, but student mentoring is inextricably tied to that educational context. And in student mentoring, the student is the primary beneficiary of any benefits. It's pretty rare that the instructor or the master gets any benefits out of a student mentoring relationship, other than, of course, the intrinsic value of feeling good about contributing to someone else's development. Workplace mentoring, which is hopefully what all of you will be moving into sooner rather than later, really has a different focus. In workplace mentoring, rather than the key differentiator being the roles, the key differentiator in workplace mentoring is the experience level. Namely, that the only thing that sets apart a mentor from a protege in workplace mentoring is their level of experience, where the mentor has more experience and the protege has less experience. Now, it's common to say things like, well, what about age? What about rank? What about position? Sure, all of those can often function as proxies for experience and can certainly be a way to identify someone with greater or lesser experience. But when we're talking about the actual practice of workplace mentoring, it's really important to emphasize that the only thing that differentiates a mentor from a protege in this context is the level of experience. Workplace mentoring is also voluntary and mutual. Student mentoring, a lot of times student mentor pairs are made by an outside organization. You're assigned somebody, you're assigned a student mentor. Workplace mentoring is different. In workplace mentoring, the relationship is voluntary on both parts, and both sides are getting a benefit out of it. Both sides are getting something from this. And certainly in the Q&A, if folks want to hear more about what kind of benefits accrue, I can certainly talk about that. Finally, workplace mentoring is always grounded in a specific professional context. It's always grounded in a particular context of a profession. For all of you, of course, today, I expect that your particular context is going to be engineering, but it can just as easily be other professional contexts such as medicine, the military. If it identifies as a profession, the bottom line is that you can find a mentoring aspect to it. On that same vein, I want to talk a little bit about some different terms that get thrown around a lot. Counseling versus coaching versus mentoring. And I recognize that for those of you who may be on smaller screens or who are calling in, that you're not going to be, you may have trouble seeing the chart on there. Again, this is why I've given Eddie a copy of my slides so that you can come back and refer to it. One of my colleagues who works on professional mentoring for women and people of color has a running joke that for the military anyway, that there's really only one word that refers to development, and it's coach, teach, mentor, where all these terms are all rolled into one word and they're all jammed together all at once. And that's because there's a tendency to use those terms interchangeably, okay, to just use coach or teach or mentor, or use all three of them together whenever we're talking about individual development. But the reality is that counseling and coaching and mentoring really do have three very separate and distinct elements to them. So just to hit on them really on the high points, counseling tends to be much more directive. It tends to be much more a function of a senior and a subordinate. And almost always all the development accrues to the subordinate within this, where it's meant to help the subordinate address specific issues, specific challenges they've had, specific problems that they've had. Coaching, on the other hand, is still more senior subordinate, but instead of being part of a formal senior subordinate relationship, it's where a subordinate has been linked up with a subject matter expert somewhere else, a coach or a trainer who has particular special knowledge. But again, it's focused about specific behaviors, specific elements that have been identified for improvement. And coaching relationships can be required or voluntary depending on the particular context. What we're going to focus on for the rest of this webinar is mentoring. And again, as I mentioned before, mentoring is voluntary. The key differentiator here is experience. And really one key thing that differentiates mentoring from coaching or counseling is that mentoring can address not only career aspects of development, but personal aspects of development as well, and helping people think about what their interpersonal relationships look like, what their interpersonal development looks like, how that speaks to other people, and how they interact with one another. So again, the rest of this talk is going to primarily focus on mentoring, but if there's questions about coaching or counseling, certainly I'm happy to take those at the end during the Q&A. So I think it's important to talk about the lifespan of a mentoring pair and how mentoring relationships grow, how they develop, and how they end. And I do need to emphasize one thing that's really important up front. All mentoring relationships end. They can end in different ways, and we'll talk about that under redefinition, but all mentoring relationships end. Sometimes there's this sense of, oh, if I'm entering into a mentoring relationship, I'm entering into it for life. I'm making this commitment for the rest of my life. Well, that's just not the case. Mentoring relationships do end. There's also a sense sometimes from people that, oh, because this mentoring relationship ended, it's a failure. I did something wrong. Well, no, again, mentoring relationships all naturally end. So let's talk about how they start and how they develop. The first phase of a mentoring relationship is what we call the initiation phase. And really what it is the idea of how the relationship is going to be formed. It's a mentor and a protege coming together and having conversations. What do we want to get out of this? What do we see as being useful? What are the areas that we really want to focus on? An initiation phase can last for up to a year. I know that may seem very long for a lot of folks, but believe it or not, it can actually take that long to really get a full sense of what you want to get out of a workplace mentoring relationship. Part of that is keep in mind that the protege in this relationship may still be getting a sense of who they are in the profession and what they want to be in the profession. So right off the bat, they may not know the right questions to ask of their mentor. They may not know the right ways to communicate what it is they're looking for, what it is that they want. So that's why that initiation phase can last for so long. So the second phase is the cultivation phase, and that is where we spend the majority of the time, ideally where we spend the majority of the time, in a mentoring relationship. And that's where you're actually living out this relationship. You're actually exchanging ideas. You're actually tapping into one another and helping one another grow throughout this relationship. But all good things do eventually come to an end. And so eventually relationships will move into the third stage, what's called separation. And this is where the protege is really starting to redefine themselves, really starting to assert more of their autonomy and start to move away from the mentor. And there can be a lot of different reasons why this is happening, right? The mentor may have moved into a different position where their experience or their perspective is not as valuable to the protege. Same thing may happen to the protege, where the protege has moved on. It may be that the protege is choosing to redefine themselves away from the profession, or the mentor is redefining themselves away from the profession. But regardless, there is this third stage where the protege really starts to redefine who they are and starts to move away. And then in the fourth stage of redefinition, that's where really the mentoring relationship has ended and it has become something else. That something else may be friendship. It may be a professional partnership, or it may simply be the end of the relationship as a whole. All of these are certainly possible, and all of these are certainly things that we've seen happen in the context of a mentoring relationship. So why do I tell you this lifespan? Well, first, because I want you to understand that mentoring relationships take time to develop. You should not expect to be able to identify a mentor, sit down with them, and right away they're going to start pushing the good stuff to you. It just doesn't work that way. You have to be able to identify for them what you're looking for. You have to be able to get a sense of what they can provide, what they can develop. And then even once you've done that, expect that there's going to be some times, there's going to be some bumps where it's going to be difficult to flesh out what it is that you're looking for from the relationship, what you're seeking to get out of it. So really be aware of how these relationships, of how these elements really flesh out and build over time, over the course of a relationship. I also think it's worth talking about when mentoring relationships go bad. The hard truth is that not all mentoring relationships play out the way we think they should. All of us are human, all of us are imperfect beings, and so sometimes we really have to recognize and look for warning signs when a relationship is going bad. The construct that I actually like to use for this is the classic 7 deadly sins. So I'm going to talk through those real quick and talk through what each of those means in terms of the overall context of workplace mentoring. So first one is pride, okay? And in the context of a mentoring relationship, pride is mirror imaging. It's wanting a protege to be, if you're a mentor, it's wanting a protege to be just like you, or if you're a protege, wanting to be just like your mentor in everything that they do. And this just isn't realistic, right? Our career choices are functions of who we are. They're functions of our unique skills, our unique capabilities. They're functions of how these elements work out. Ben, I see your question. I'm going to hold the virtual mentoring question until the end, but I will definitely get to it. It's really an element of, and so mirror imaging is really about trying to make somebody else exactly like you, or trying to be exactly like somebody else. Wrath is typically on the part of a mentor's part, and it usually involves anger at a protege's career choices and decisions. This is similar to pride in that you're wanting a protege to be just like you, but specifically it's when a mentor gets so angry at a protege for making particular career choices, for making particular career decisions, that they ultimately decide, you know what, I'm done with you. I can't believe you did this. I can't believe you betrayed me like this. How dare you? And they break off the mentoring relationship. The flip side of wrath is envy, which is where a mentor or protege gets so jealous of the other person because of a particular career success that puts them on a different path, sends them down a different avenue, gets them going in a different direction. And again, for both wrath and envy, you can easily see how these would be destructive, right? You can see how somebody who's suffering from this might make bad recommendations because they think, oh, well, you're not going to listen to me anyway, so I'll just say whatever the heck I want, and we'll see what you do with it. It may lead them to become uncommunicative. And so when you're seeing these signs manifesting, you have to have an honest conversation about, hey, I feel like you're no longer on my team. I feel like you're no longer on my side. The next one is gluttony. And gluttony in a mentoring context, simply put, is taking on too many mentors or proteges. Now, I need to be nuanced in how I couch this because there's a traditional conception of mentoring that it's always one-on-one, that you can only have one mentor, that you can only have one protege. Well, in fact, what we know about actual mentoring practice doesn't support that. More and more, what a lot of people are taking on is what we call a networked approach to mentoring, where, especially for a protege, where they'll reach out to multiple mentors and they'll reach out and try and get input from multiple mentors on a particular issue or a particular challenge at once, and then synthesize the context that they've got, the advice that they've got, in order to really make the best decision that exists for them. Likewise, there can absolutely be mentors out there who have more than one protege. I have more than one protege right now, and that works because it's very rare that all of my proteges hit me with questions all at once. Instead, it tends to be staggered. The engagement tends to be kind of spread out a little bit. But what I mean by gluttony is that you have taken on so many mentors or so many proteges that you simply can't give them the attention that they're due. You can't respond to their notes in a timely manner. You can't respond to their questions. You can't acknowledge their responses in a timely manner. And I think it's really important to emphasize that this absolutely applies for both proteges and as to mentors. Proteges, when your mentors give you advice, you owe them acknowledgement of that advice. It shouldn't just be your mentor talking to a brick wall. You owe them acknowledgement. Even if you don't necessarily agree with them, that's helpful to them. Share those ideas with them. Share those insights. Ultimately, that's going to make them better mentors. The next one is sloth, and this is similar to gluttony in the idea of not responding to mentoring engagements or requests, just leaving things hanging out there. We've all been that person on the other side of a text message where we see those 3 dots, and those 3 dots just sit there, and they hang there, and they hang there, and they hang there. And you're like, what is going on? Why is this person not responding to me? Well, that can happen in a mentoring relationship as well, where you meet with somebody and you say, hey, I'd really like to follow up on this. Oh, yeah, we'll absolutely talk about that. then dead silence. Nothing comes out of it. Maybe it's that a mentor doesn't respond to an email. Maybe it's that they don't respond to a text message. Maybe it's that a protege doesn't acknowledge what you've sent to them and what you've given to them, and it's just silence overall. So sloth is definitely a factor and definitely something to be aware of. Greed is a key one in mentoring, and specifically what I refer to in greed is exploiting the knowledge of a mentoring relationship without someone's consent. It's really important to remember that mentoring relationships are intimate relationships, and people are sharing things in a mentoring relationship that they don't share more broadly, that they don't put out there more broadly. And so greed in a mentoring relationship is when a mentor shares some particular piece of information, particular piece of insight, and you turn around and you use that insight for your career progression or for your advantage without getting the mentor's permission. It may be that that mentor was just sharing that with you as an insight, but doesn't want you actually acting on it. Likewise for proteges, a protege may share something with their mentor, share something deeply private, and the mentor may decide that, oh, I'm going to white knight this, and I'm going to go running out, and I'm going to share this with somebody else so I can help them. Well, that protege didn't necessarily share that with you for you to go out and help them. That protege may have just shared that with you because they were trying to kind of parse through it. They were trying to get a sense of what they needed to do and how they needed to grapple with things. So it's really important that when you want to act on knowledge that's shared in the context of a mentoring relationship, you absolutely have to get that other individual's explicit consent before you move out on it. Don't just assume that, well, they shared it with me and we have a great relationship, so therefore it must be fine. They've given me tacit consent. No, absolutely not. Get their explicit consent of, hey, can I share this with somebody else? Yes or no. Make it explicit, make it clear. The final piece, the final deadly sin when it comes to mentoring relationships is lust. So I will tell you this, there are not a lot of hard and fast relationships when it comes, or hard and fast rules when it comes to mentoring. But one hard and fast rule that I feel comfortable saying exists regardless of workplace context, regardless of relationship is, if you're having sex with somebody in a mentoring relationship, it is no longer a mentoring relationship. Okay, mentoring relationships are intimate relationships, as I said before, but there is a difference between intimate and romantic. Once you cross the line over into romantic, it is no longer a mentoring relationship. It is something else entirely. And so a big part of mentoring relationships is making sure that personal boundaries remain in place so that mentoring relationships don't cross that boundary from romantic into intimate. It can certainly happen sometimes that there are perceptions of mentoring relationships becoming intimate relationships. Sometimes there's not a lot you can do about that other than being open and honest and candid about who your mentor is, who your protege is, and what the relationship is. But you absolutely have to guard against any sign that that mentoring relationship is crossing that boundary from intimate to romantic. And if you see that happening, there needs to be a conversation about it immediately. So what I would say in general on all of these is, if you start to see any of these warning signs, you shouldn't feel like you have to immediately end the relationship. Now, of course, the caveat to that is, if they've crossed the line and become abusive, all right, now we have a problem, and now you probably need to end the relationship. But if you start to see warning signs in some of these areas, if you start to feel like this is coming out, communicate with your other party in this mentoring relationship. Communicate with your mentor. Communicate with your protege. Share the fact that, hey, I'm really concerned that I see you seem to be really upset with my career choices. Hey, I'm really concerned that you sent me flowers the other day and that doesn't feel particularly appropriate to me. Have that conversation, because they may not realize what they're doing. They may not realize what's happening in the mentoring relationship. So when you see these warning signs, have these conversations, okay? Engage in these ideas, and potentially you may be able to salvage a relationship before it really goes all the way bad. So I've thrown a lot at you over the last 25 minutes, and so I think it's only fair to kind of wrap this up by talking about, okay, great, you've given me all these things. How do I get started? What do I actually do with all this knowledge that you've dropped on me? So let me give you a couple ideas. There's a tendency when you're trying to start a mentoring relationship to immediately look for what I call mentoring faces. And by mentoring faces, I mean I want to go out and I want to find that one perfect individual for me who's going to be my mentor forever and ever, amen, and we'll be good from that point forward. And that's wonderful if you could start out and find that. But it's pretty rare that people can identify those individuals right off the bat. More often, what you have to do is you have to get in a position where you can actually get to know somebody a little bit better, where you can actually identify more of what it is that they're interested in, what they bring to the table, and what they can help you think more about. So for that, what I encourage people to do is, instead of looking for mentoring faces, look for mentoring spaces that are convenient to you. And all a mentoring space doesn't have to be a room with a big sign over it that says mentoring here. All a mentoring space is it's a place where people share things about themselves that they wouldn't normally share in the workplace. And these can take all kinds of different forms. It may be a social call after work where people get together. It may be a water cooler space at work where people hang out and talk about different things and talk about their lives. It may be a formally created mentoring space where organizations specifically set aside for people to share ideas and share information and share stories. All of those work, okay? All of those are feasible. All of those are practical. The key is to put yourself out in these mentoring spaces and put yourself out in a way that people can learn more about you and you can learn more about others. Another piece is tell your mentoring stories. Talk about the mentoring experiences that you had as a student, and if you've had earlier mentoring workplace experiences, by all means, share those stories as well. Sharing the stories does a couple of things. First, it signals that you are interested in mentoring and you are serious about it, that this isn't just something that you're doing because somebody on a webinar told you about it or your buddy did it. You're doing this because it's meaningful to you and it's important to you. It also helps socialize the practice of mentoring within a workplace. To that end, if somebody is your mentor, call them your mentor. Don't call them, my senior person or whatever. Call them your mentor and encourage them to refer to you as their protege. Again, this socialization of the terms helps make it feasible for other people to share their mentoring stories, for other people to share different elements of what's happening in your life. And finally, educate yourself about mentoring practices. You've done a first step already by participating in this webinar. There are other webinars that I've done for the Society of American Military Engineers that's hosted in some of the different COIs. So you're welcome to explore those. I talk about different aspects of mentoring practices in there. And then just look for mentoring stories that are out there in your profession, and look for ways to educate yourself about what mentoring looks like in your profession. Certainly, if your organization, if your workplace offers mentoring training, more and more people actually do offer mentoring training, then it's helpful to take that training and get a sense of what your workplace actually expects of you. So I hope all of that was helpful. I want to go ahead and open the floor for questions. I see that there's a couple queued up in the chat box. So I'm just going to go ahead and go through those, and then we'll open up the floor for additional questions as well. Ben asked the question, can mentoring take place virtually? How often does there need to be a formal touch? Ben, absolutely. And this is one of the areas that has really evolved as an area of study in its own in mentoring over the last decade or two, as electronic communication has become more ubiquitous, become more present. There's a lot of different names for it. The formal name that a lot of people use is computer-mediated communications mentoring, or CMC mentoring for short. It's pretty clunky, to be honest with you. So what a lot of folks informally refer to it is as e-mentoring, and that way it kind of covers the whole kind of wide spectrum. And e-mentoring is absolutely a thing. Now, what I have found as I did my own research and as I looked through the literature is that it's very rare to have a mentoring relationship that forms in an e-mentoring venue and continues throughout an e-mentoring venue. It is just really hard to build and establish the trust that is necessary for a mentoring relationship to thrive. What can happen is that people meet each other in virtual spaces, they see each other in virtual spaces, they get a sense of, hey, this individual has characteristics that I'm interested in, and then they further engage and potentially meet face to face and agree that, hey, yeah, this is something, we want to pursue this more. It's also feasible that a relationship that begins face-to-face can be extended through virtual means. And this I heard a lot from the folks that I researched with, that they felt like social media, email, text extended the life of mentoring relationships out beyond what they would be. This was especially prevalent for military folks because military folks move around so much that they really felt that being able to stay in touch on social media, being able to stay in touch with the occasional phone call, the occasional text via email was really, really powerful for them. One of the questions that I typically get is, well, what areas or what virtual spaces are good for mentoring? And I would say that any virtual space that allows you to have sustained communication is a good thing. Interestingly enough, when I did my original dissertation research back in 2014, 2015, the space that was identified as the single most usable space for e-mentoring was Facebook. It would be really interesting to me to go back and revisit with folks now and see if that's still the case, given all of the problems that Facebook has had with privacy and with fake profiles and things like that. I'm not sure that that would still be the case, but that was the case when I did my initial research 5 or 6 years ago. Ben, and the second part of Ben's question, how often does there need to be a formal touch? I think that really is just a function of the mentor and the protege and what you're seeking to get out of the relationship. There are certainly times when I only engage with my mentors maybe once a month, my proteges rather, once a month, once a quarter. Because I'm fairly senior, my engagements with my mentors are even less frequent, probably maybe once or twice, maybe 3 times a year. So I would really hesitate to quote a hard and fast number. Really what it's all about is how often do you need to communicate to stay familiar with this individual, to keep a sense of what's going on in their life. And again, this is why Facebook was helpful, because you could get a sense, you could see somebody's status updates, you could see somebody's posts and get a sense of what was going on there. Twitter, certainly, Instagram, other social media functions can have a very similar function. Ben, I hope that answered your question. If not, feel free to chime back in the chat box. Eddie poses a question, can you have multiple mentors focused on different parts of your career or academic pursuit? Yes, absolutely. You can certainly have, oh, I think you all may have lost me.
You're still on, Ray? Okay,
I'm still on. Got it. I had a weird note pop up that said it lost me. So good. So I was talking about Eddie's question of multiple mentors focused on different parts of academic pursuits. Yes, absolutely. You may find that you have a particular mentor that is helpful for career skills within your profession. You may find that a particular mentor is helpful for getting you to think about, hey, what does my career path look like? What are the next couple of jobs that I want to tackle? What are the next couple of elements that come on here? You may have another mentor who is particularly helpful for interpersonal skills, what we call psychosocial skills. These are, how do I relate to people? How do I help people in getting these different ideas and getting these different elements? So yes, you can absolutely have multiple mentors focused on different parts. And this can be something that's really helpful to communicate to a mentor, is to say, hey, the thing that really attracted me to you as a mentor is you seem like somebody who handles conflict really well. And I want to know more about how I do that because I suck at it. or, hey, you're somebody who has a career path that I really admire, and I just have no clue how to get on that career path. Can you help me? Can you help bring me in on this? Eddie's next question, how often should someone change out their mentor? I don't think of it so much as changing out a mentor, but more making sure that your mentor is relevant to what you want to do and what you want to have. So it may be less of a case, again, going back to this idea of multiple mentors, it may be less of a case, excuse me for a minute. Sorry about that. It may be less of a case that you're setting a mentor aside as you're communicating less frequently with that mentor because you're focused on different aspects of your life. Again, I think it's really crucial to openly communicate that with your mentor and say, look, it's not that I no longer value you as a mentor, you've been really helpful to me, but I'm focusing on X aspect of my life, and I feel like honestly you're less helpful in that particular respect, but I still want to keep you as a mentor because I think in the future, and as long as you're open and candid about that, I think most mentors will be fine. I have had mentoring relationships that were like that, where my protege, because she moved into a different field, she said, hey, I have to tell you, I feel like, where you are, when she's talking to me, where you are in your career is less relevant to me right now. And that was fine. And then we actually picked up the relationship a couple of years later when she came on to another career path where she's going to be an instructor here at the Academy. And so we renewed our relationship on that basis. Ben asked, how can organizations like SAME help identify mentors for students and young professionals doing matchmaking work? Yeah, often a challenge to get mentors and proteges in the same space. One of the things that I heard about in previous webinars was SAME chapters that would set up mentoring events. And I do think that is probably the best way for an organization like SCMA to do this. Certainly, it is possible to set up things like mentoring portals where people can come together and engage one another and potentially find mentoring pairs. But mentoring portals can be really problematic because you don't necessarily know that somebody is representing themselves accurately in that portal, right? Somebody may say they have all this experience, but it turns out that they don't. The Army actually tried a mentoring portal many years ago, about 15 years ago, and it crashed and burned for this exact reason, that there were folks on there who were representing themselves and saying, oh, I'm, this person, I'm a strategic expert. Well, and it turns out that the only reason that this person called themselves strategic expert was that they'd been playing Command and Conquer for years. I know many of you will probably not get that reference, and that's okay. So I think this is an area where local chapters have a real strength because local chapters have a mechanism for folks to actually verify the identity of the people who are participating and verify what it is that they're bringing. So for the local chapters, things that I would suggest, one mentoring mechanism that is really popular when I talked about mentoring spaces is what we call mentoring speed dating, okay? And all mentoring speed dating is nothing more than getting a bunch of potential mentors and potential proteges together in a room and setting up some kind of mechanism where they can talk, they can share ideas, touch base briefly for like a minute or two, and then move on to somebody else, There's no long-standing expectation of, oh, I'm going to spend 15, 20, 30 minutes. It's, hey, couple of minutes and then we're going to move on. And then there's an opportunity at the end of that for potential mentors and proteges to identify one another, and then there's a matching mechanism. So that's one option. Another thing is that you can look for opportunities to sponsor mentoring education like this. This can be a supplement to things that are offered in workplaces because not all workplaces have mentoring education programs. So that would be the two areas that I think an organization like SAME can really make a difference. Eddie's question, if a mentoring relationship sours, what are some tactics to extract yourself from the relationship? Yeah. So first and foremost, certainly communicate where you feel like the relationship is going wrong, and look for those opportunities to get it back on the right path. But if you do that communication and it's simply not working, the person is simply being stubborn, then I think it's worth it to clearly communicate and say, you know what, I think it is time to end this relationship. I certainly express sincere appreciation for what they've brought to the relationship. Bring out, the areas that you feel like they were really helpful, they were really useful, but then say, hey, all mentoring relationships end, and I feel like it's time for this one to end. And I think it's important to communicate that very clearly and unambiguously. Don't soft shoe it, don't soft pedal it, don't say, well, maybe we'll just take a break for a little while. You owe them a clear and unambiguous statement of, hey, I think this has not, I think this relationship has really kind of culminated. I think both of us have gotten everything that we're going to get out of it. So let's move on. Let's move on to something else. Hopefully that's sufficient. If unfortunately the other party wants to continue and continues to press on this and won't take no for an answer, at that point it may be time to invoke your local human resources branch and bring them into the conversation, or bring in other professionals into the conversation. Because if somebody is not taking no for an answer, there are clearly bigger and more systemic problems here that need to be addressed. Okay, that is the questions in the chat box. So let me go ahead and pause here for a little bit and see if there's questions that folks would like to bring out on audio Vice in the chat box.
The lines are open, so if you have a question, feel free to unmute your phone. Sir, I'll ask one more. Do you find that some of these mentoring relationships last throughout a career? Or would one expect that, if you create a good match, that a mentoring relationship would extend decades?
I could absolutely see that happening in a civilian workplace context where there's no kind of up or out forcing mechanism where people can stay in that profession for decades. I absolutely think it's feasible for a mentoring relationship to last for decades. I think it is less likely for that to happen in the military because of our up or out system that eventually forces people out, at the 20-year mark, 30-year mark, whatever the case may be. Because once you've moved on from that profession, it just becomes harder and harder to remain relevant. And so by extension, it makes it harder and harder to maintain that mentoring relationship. So yeah, I think the military has a unique challenge in that regard. For civilian workplaces, I could absolutely see that happening. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Any more questions from the field? Great. Well, this is an ongoing conversation. Colonel Kimball is involved in a number of our other communities of interest, including supporting our student members. So you'll be hearing more from him throughout the year. He's also going to be giving a presentation at the Joint Engineer Training Conference in DC in May. I do want to remind everyone on the phone that student registration is free to our events. So please consider, if you're a student attending or if you have access to networks of students, encourage them to apply to register for those events. Other than that, thank you, sir, for your participation and for everyone else joining us. And yeah, we'll send out the PDF of the slides, a link, and a link to the recording afterwards for future reference. So thank you, everyone.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Eddie.
Certainly.